The gravel crunched beneath the wheels of my chair, a slow, grinding sound that echoed against the empty canyon walls. I remember the sun glaring down so bright it painted everything in blinding gold, but inside me the air felt cold. My sister Melissa's hand was firm on the back of my wheelchair, steady, deliberate as she pushed me forward toward the overlook. The air smelled of pine needles and dust, but underneath it there was something metallic sharp like fear itself. I looked up at her face and saw no hesitation, no warmth, just that same polished smile she always wore when she wanted the world to believe she was perfect. The words came out of her mouth so softly, I almost thought I imagined them. You were never really family. You were adopted. Nobody will care if you disappear. My chest clenched. I gripped the sides of my wheelchair so hard my knuckles whitened, but I knew she would not stop. Her voice, calm and cutting, felt colder than the wind swirling off the cliff edge. My heart hammered like a drum, each beat louder than the last as I realized what was about to happen. I tried to turn my head to plead, to beg her to see me, but Melissa leaned down close and whispered again, her breath warm against my ear. It is better this way. You were always the mistake. Her words hit harder than the push itself, but then it happened. She shoved the chair forward with one final movement, not rough or violent, but slow and merciless, the kind of push that told me she had been planning this moment for years. My wheels rolled faster, gravel spitting out beneath them, and suddenly there was no more ground. For an instant, everything went silent. The world tilted. My body leaned forward as the wheelchair tipped over the edge. I screamed not for help, but for her, because a small part of me still believed she might pull me back, that she might remember I was her sister, even if blood did not tie us. But her face did not change. She stood there watching eyes, cold arms crossed her silhouette sharp against the burning sky. And then I fell. The air rushed past me like a scream, with no sound. My stomach rose into my throat. My crayons, the ones I had carried in my lap, scattered into the air, like confetti of broken dreams catching the light for one beautiful second before plummeting with me. The cliff face blurred. The sky turned upside down. The sound of the wind roared so loud it drowned every other thought except one single word. Why? Why was I never enough? Why did she hate me for something I could not control? Why did the fact I was adopted erase everything I had ever tried to be? I saw the flash of rocks below, jagged, waiting. I braced for the impact, but it came with water instead, an icy slap that tore the breath from my lungs. The river swallowed me whole. My arms flailed, my legs were nothing but dead weight, and my scream turned into a mouthful of freezing water. Darkness closed in quick and merciless. The last thing I heard above the roar of the river was her voice fading, almost casual, almost satisfied. You were never one of us. Then the sound of her heels clicking on the gravel as she walked away, leaving me to die beneath the water that pulled me down like chains. At that moment, before the current dragged me under, I understood the truth. I had not just been betrayed. I had been erased. Growing up, I never felt like home was truly mine. Our house looked perfect from the outside, a 2-story suburban dream with white shutters, a manicured lawn, and a polished brass knocker that gleamed in the California sun. Neighbors admired us. Teachers spoke fondly of my family, and everyone believed we were the model of stability. Inside, though, the air was different. Every breath carried the weight of judgment. Every glance from my parents held a silent criticism, and every laugh of my sister Melissa was a reminder that I was always the shadow in a family that only wanted light. My mother ruled the house with a voice that could cut through steel. She valued appearances more than truth presentation, more than affection. To her, Melissa was the shining example, the daughter who could do no wrong, while I was the burden in the corner, the one who slowed things down, the one who required explanations when others asked questions about my health in my wheelchair. My father rarely intervened. He sat at the dining table with his newspaper or buried himself in work, pretending not to hear the arguments, the snide remarks, the cruelty that dripped from Melissa's lips when she called me useless. His silence was worse than words, because it meant he had chosen not to see me. Melissa thrived in that silence. She knew she was untouchable. She would strut through the house like a queen, tossing her hair back, mocking me with whispers sharp enough to slice skin. Sometimes she would lean in close and mutter things only I could hear, like "you ruin every room you enter," or "maybe mom should have left you at the hospital." I learned to shrink to make myself smaller to avoid giving her fuel, but even that was not enough. The more invisible I tried to become, the louder she grew. School was no refuge. Teachers praised Melissa's grades, her leadership in clubs, her flawless smiles at parent-teacher meetings. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one in the back, always compared, always found lacking. If Melissa brought home a trophy, my mother displayed it front and center. If I drew a picture, it ended up in the trash. It was not just neglect, it was erasure. Like my existence was a mistake they were all waiting to correct. The control seeped into every decision. I was not allowed to choose my clothes, my meals, even the way I decorated my wheelchair. If I protested, my mother's voice snapped like a whip. "Do not embarrass us. Be grateful." Melissa would grin, watching me flinch, enjoying every second of my humiliation. Holidays were the worst. Melissa opened piles of gifts, her laughter filling the room, while I unwrapped token presents chosen without thought. Birthdays passed with perfunctory cake for me and extravagant parties for her. Guests noticed sometimes they even looked uneasy, but no one ever spoke up. That was the power my mother held. She curated the image so well that outsiders never saw the cracks. Inside, I carried the weight of knowing I was never truly part of them, even before Melissa revealed it on the cliff. There were moments that almost gave it away. Late at night, I heard hushed conversations through thin walls, my mother saying she never should have agreed to it, Melissa asking why we kept her, my father murmuring about appearances. At 7, at 10, at 15, I did not understand, but I felt it in my bones, the unspoken truth that I was the outsider in my own family. Those years carved me into silence. I learned that love was conditional, that acceptance came with strings I could never untangle. And through it all, Melissa grew sharper, bolder, feeding off the imbalance, shaping herself into the perfect golden child, while I was reduced to a shadow, an inconvenience, a secret they never intended to keep. Melissa was the kind of girl who could walk into a room and make every head turn. She had glossy hair that shimmered like sunlight, eyes that sparkled with confidence, and a smile trained to disarm. To the world outside, she was flawless, the golden daughter, the role model every parent wished for. Teachers adored her, neighbors complimented her, even strangers at the grocery store leaned in to say how beautiful and charming she was. She excelled in sports-made honor roll every semester and spoke with a poise that suggested she was born to be admired. But behind closed doors, the polish cracked. Her charm was a mask, and when the mask slipped, what stared back was cruelty sharpened into something almost artful. She did not simply tease me like siblings sometimes do. She orchestrated my humiliation with precision. She knew the weak spots in my armor, the insecurities I carried like scars, and she pressed them until I bled. If guests visited, she performed her kindness, patting my shoulder, offering to help me reach something, smiling as though she adored me. The second the door closed behind them, her words turned venomous. "You ruin everything. You should not even be here." Sometimes she would place her hands on the back of my wheelchair and lean forward, pressing her weight down until my chest tightened. "Does it scare you when I do this?" she would whisper, and then laugh when I flinched. When our parents left us alone, the games became worse. She shoved me into corners, trapped me in closets, yanked the brakes on my wheelchair so hard, the jolt rattled through my bones. Once she pushed me against the wall, her face inches from mine, and hissed, "If you tell anyone, I will make sure you regret it." I believed her because every time I had tried to speak up, the result was the same. My mother's eyes rolled, my father stayed silent, and Melissa played the victim. She would pout, crocodile tears welling, and say I was only trying to help her. She misunderstood, and I was left branded as the dramatic one, the ungrateful one, the difficult child. That was the genius of Melissa. She built an image so impenetrable that no one questioned her. At school, she organized charity drives. At church, she volunteered with children. On social media, she posted photos of us together, always angled to make it appear like she was the protective big sister. People commented things like goals and "I wish I had a sister like you." They had no idea what happened once the camera switched off. For me, home was not a place of safety but a theater, and Melissa was the star actress. She played her role so convincingly that even I sometimes wondered if I was the one imagining the darkness behind her eyes. There were small tells, though. The way her smile stretched just a little too wide when she had cornered me, the way her voice dropped an octave when she whispered threats, the way her laughter rang hollow when no one else was listening. Those were the pieces of the real Melissa that only I ever saw. She thrived on dominance. My disability was not just an inconvenience to her, it was an opportunity. She relished the control it gave her the ability to remind me daily that she was strong where I was weak, chosen where I was disposable. Sometimes she would lift her chin and say, if I had been the one adopted, they would have sent me back. But you, they kept for reasons I will never understand. Her cruelty was not impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and worst of all, protected by the very people who should have defended me. My mother called her passionate. My father called her spirited. I called her dangerous. Every scar on my heart had her name carved into it. By the time I reached my 20s, I knew that Melissa was not just my sister. She was my captor, my tormentor, the villain in a story I had not yet found the strength to rewrite. When I look back now, the signs were always there, scattered like puzzle pieces I was too young to fit together. There were nights when I lay awake in bed and heard muffled voices drifting down the hallway. My mother's voice, sharp and impatient, carried through the walls as she said things like, I should never have agreed to this, or she was never supposed to stay. Sometimes Melissa would giggle in response, asking why we kept her, and my father would mutter something about appearances, about what people might think. At the time, I did not understand what their words meant, but I felt the chill they left behind. A chill that settled in my bones long before Melissa ever whispered the word adopted on that cliff. Birthdays were the clearest clue. When Melissa's birthday came around, the house turned into a festival. Balloons floated against the ceiling, streamers crisscrossed the walls, and neighbors gathered for cake and laughter. Photographers snapped pictures of her blowing out candles on a 3-tier cake, her face glowing in the light. My birthdays were quieter, sometimes almost invisible. A single cake from his grocery store with the name Emily scrawled in sloppy icing, a forced smile from my mother, and a few unwrapped gifts that looked like afterthoughts. Once Melissa leaned over while I cut my cake and whispered, "It is funny, isn't it, how no one ever bothers to show up for you?" That sting stayed with me for years. School projects were another reminder. When I drew family portraits with crayons, my teacher praised Melissa's drawings as neat and beautiful. Mine, messy and childlike, went unnoticed, and when I brought them home, my mother would raise an eyebrow, shake her head, and drop them into the trash. Melissa once pulled one out and waved it in front of me, saying, "Maybe you should draw your real family next time before laughing and tearing it in half." At church, the subtle difference was clearer. Other families sat together with warmth, parents resting their hands on children's shoulders, siblings whispering secrets during hymns. My family sat polished and still, my mother's arm always looped around Melissa, my father's attention fixed straight ahead. I sat alone, the space between us as wide as a canyon, pretending not to notice that my mother never touched me the same way. Even neighbors noticed things without realizing what they were seeing. I overheard Mrs. Carson once comment to my mother, "You two look so much alike," referring to her and Melissa. Her eyes flicked briefly toward me, then she added hesitantly, "And she must take after your husband." My mother's lips curved into a smile, but her eyes narrowed, and I felt myself shrink even smaller in that moment. The most painful sign came in small gestures, the kind a child should not have to interpret. The way my mother's hand would hesitate before brushing hair out of my face, the way my father avoided eye contact when I asked questions about when I was born, the way Melissa smirked whenever strangers asked if we were sisters. I always knew something was off, even if I could not name it. I carried that unease like a shadow, following me through every year of my life, reminding me that I did not quite fit into the picture-perfect frame they wanted to present to the world. Long before the cliff, long before the push, the truth had been whispering around me in fragments. I just had not been ready to hear it. The morning she took me to the cliffs began deceptively ordinary. Melissa appeared in my doorway with a smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "Let's go for a drive, just the two of us." The words were sweet, almost sisterly, but something in her tone set off a quiet alarm in my chest. I wanted to refuse to say I had plans or did not feel well, but her voice carried that commanding edge I had learned not to argue with. So I let her help me into the car, my chair folded in the back, my crayons in my lap, like they had always been my only comfort. The drive stretched on longer than I expected, winding roads through pine forests that grew denser with each mile. Melissa hummed along with the radio, tapping her manicured nails on the wheel, glancing at me now and then with an expression I could not read. The air inside the car smelled faintly of her perfume, expensive and sharp, a smell that always made me feel like I was trespassing in her world. When she finally pulled over, we were at an overlook I had never seen before. The cliff dropped steeply into a river that rushed far below its sound, rising like distant thunder. The air was fresh, the kind that should have been freeing, but to me it felt suffocating. Melissa unfolded my wheelchair with practiced ease, lifted me into it with more force than necessary, and began rolling me toward the edge. I clutched my crayon pouch tighter, my stomach twisting as the gravel under my wheels cracked like bones. She spread a blanket on the ground, set down a picnic basket, and even handed me a juice box. For a brief moment, I almost believed her act, almost thought maybe she was trying to change, to give me one day where I felt like her sister. I whispered, "This is the nicest thing you have ever done for me, Melissa." Her body stiffened, her hands pausing for a fraction of a second. Then she stood tall, her shadow stretching long across the dirt, and circled behind me. "You know," she said in a tone too calm to be real, "sometimes we have to make choices that hurt. Grown-up choices." I craned my neck to look at her, confusion knotting in my chest. "What do you mean?" She leaned down, her breath hot against my ear, and whispered, "You were adopted. You don't belong. Time to erase the mistake." My throat closed. My heart plummeted before my chair did. I managed a single word. "Please," but she ignored it. Her hands gripped the handles of my wheelchair, steady, deliberate. The world slowed, every sound drawn out. The crunch of her heels on gravel, the whisper of wind through the pines, the hollow snap as she released the brakes. Then the push. Not violent, not hurried, but cold and final, a gesture she had rehearsed in her mind for years. The wheels rolled forward, gathering speed, and I realized this was not a moment of rage. It was premeditated. She had decided long ago that I was expendable. I screamed not because I thought she would save me, but because a small part of me still longed for her to see me, to change her mind, to be the sister she pretended to be in front of others. But her face remained impassive, carved in stone. The edge disappeared beneath me. The sky tilted and the ground rushed up. My crayons spilled from my lap, scattering in the air like broken stars, and then the water swallowed me whole. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. Cold closed around me, pulling me down fast. My arms flailed, but my legs hung useless, dragging me deeper. The taste of river filled my mouth, bitter and suffocating. Above the roar of the current, I heard her final words echoing in my memory. "You were never one of us." The betrayal cut deeper than the water ever could. I sank with the weight of knowing that my family had not just failed me. They had chosen to end me, and Melissa, my sister, my blood in name, but not in truth, had made sure of it. The river was not merciful. It dragged me under, spinning me like a discarded rag doll, my arms clawing at nothing as the current pulled me deeper into its dark throat. My lungs screamed for air, my chest burned, and for a terrifying instant I surrendered to the idea that this was it, that Melissa had succeeded, that the world would close on me here in silence. My crayons, those little sticks of fragile hope, floated past me in every direction like a constellation breaking apart. I reached for them out of instinct, but the current scattered them beyond my grasp. I was weightless and heavy at once, sinking into the cold abyss. Just as the edges of my vision darkened, strong arms wrapped around me. I felt the tug upward, steady and relentless against the grip of the current that wanted to keep me. The surface shattered above me in a rush of air and light, and I coughed violently, water burning up my throat. The voice that cut through the chaos was steady, masculine, commanding, yet urgent. "Hold on! I've got you!" His arms cradled me like I weighed nothing, though I knew my dead weight had to strain him. I clung weakly to the fabric of his shirt as he kicked against the current, guiding us toward the rocky shore. Each stroke was precise, practiced as if he had saved drowning souls before. When he finally pulled me onto the gravel bank, I collapsed against the earth, coughing until I could breathe again. The world blurred in and out, my body trembling, water dripping from my hair and clothes. I looked up through the haze and saw him tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered wet against his forehead, and eyes that burned with a kind of determined fury I had never seen directed at me before. He pressed 2 fingers to my pulse, nodded once as though satisfied, and whispered, "You're alive. Stay with me." His voice carried a weight that anchored me back into existence. He shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around my shoulders, the warmth of it almost painful against my frozen skin. I shivered not just from the cold, but from the echo of Melissa's betrayal ringing in my ears. Through chattering teeth, I whispered, "She tried to kill me. My sister." He met my gaze and didn't flinch. "I know. I saw everything." My heart lurched. The fact that someone else had witnessed what Melissa had done meant I was no longer screaming into the void. For the first time, the truth had another pair of eyes to hold it. He introduced himself simply. "Henry." A hiker, he explained, who had been taking the lower trail along the river when he noticed Melissa wheel me dangerously close to the edge. He had shouted, but the wind swallowed his voice. By the time he scrambled up the slope, it was too late. I was already falling. He had dove into the river without hesitation. His hands, calloused and rough, now brushed wet hair from my forehead with surprising gentleness. "You're safe now," he said, but the way his jaw tightened told me he did not believe it yet. I clung to his words, though, because no one had ever said them to me with conviction. As he lifted me carefully into his arms, carrying me away from the cliff's shadow, I realized something profound. Melissa's attempt to erase me had failed, and fate, or maybe mercy, had placed a witness and savior in my path. For the first time in my life, I was not invisible. And in that fragile moment between death and survival, I understood that my story was no longer just mine. It was evidence. It was justice waiting to happen. The ambulance lights painted the night in harsh flashes of red and white as Henry carried me to the paramedics waiting at the trailhead. I was shivering so hard I could barely speak, my lips tinged blue, my fingers clawing at the blanket they wrapped around me. The medics worked quickly, checking my oxygen levels, strapping monitors onto my skin and asking endless questions, but my voice cracked on the simplest answers. All I could say, over and over, was, "My sister tried to kill me." They exchanged glances, polite but unconvinced, like they had heard countless delirious patients cry wolf in emergencies. It was Henry's steady testimony that made them pause. He told them how he saw Melissa shove my wheelchair toward the cliff, how he tried to intervene, how he leapt into the water when he saw me vanish beneath the surface. His voice carried this kind of conviction that demanded attention. By the time they loaded me into the ambulance, my words had weight because he had given them his credibility. At the hospital, the bright white lights burned my eyes, the antiseptic smell wrapping around me in a way that reminded me of too many hidden injuries from before. Doctors rushed me into exams, x-rays, CT scans, blood work. The icy water had strained my lungs, and my ribs ached from the river's violent embrace. Bruises bloomed across my body, evidence etched into my skin. Yet I knew, as always, the physical wounds were only the surface. The deeper scar was betrayal. I drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of voices. Nurses saying I was lucky to be alive. Henry refusing to leave my side, the faint hum of machines that kept track of my fragile body. When I finally woke properly, Mom and Dad were in the room. Their faces were carved in stone, but not the way I wanted. Not fear for my life. Not gratitude that I had survived. Anger. Disbelief. Mom leaned in first, her voice sharp as a blade. "What did you do now?" she hissed, as if I had staged the whole ordeal for attention. Dad folded his arms across his chest and gave Henry a glare that could have burned holes through steel. "You're lying," he snapped before Henry even opened his mouth. "Melissa would never hurt her sister. She loves her." I almost laughed a dry, bitter sound. If love meant bruises, broken bones, and an attempted murder disguised as an accident, then yes, Melissa loved me fiercely. Henry didn't back down. He described in meticulous detail what he had seen. How Melissa's hands weren't trembling from shock, but from rage. How her face twisted when she shoved the chair. He even pulled out his phone to show the shaky video he had captured after the wheelchair teetering at the cliff's edge. Melissa's face pale but not panicked, just annoyed. That clip changed the room. The doctors and nurses froze their eyes, widening. For once, my truth had evidence beyond my broken body. But my parents weren't moved. Mom's lips pressed into a hard line and Dad's face turned red. "You don't understand family," Mom spat at Henry. "Sisters fight. You outsiders always twist it into something it's not." Henry's jaw tightened. "Attempted murder isn't a family squabble." The room buzzed with tension. I tried to speak my throat dry, but all I managed was a whisper. "She wanted me gone." The nurse at my bedside squeezed my hand, her eyes softening. I knew then she believed me, even if my parents never would. The hospital contacted the police, and soon officers arrived, their notepads ready. They took Henry's statement first, then mine, though my words stumbled over sobs and tremors. Still, they listened. They asked about history, about other incidents, and I could feel years of silence unraveling with every answer. I told them about the chair leg Melissa smashed into my ribs last year, the fire she locked me in during childhood, the countless bruises I had to explain away as clumsiness. My voice wavered, but Henry's hand steady on my shoulder kept me from collapsing under the weight of my own memories. The officers exchanged looks that weren't skeptical, they were calculating. Melissa was no longer just my sister in their eyes. She was a suspect. Mom erupted then, shrieking about betrayal, about airing family business in front of strangers. Dad tried to block the officers, his voice booming that they had no right to criminalize his daughter. But the officers calmly informed them that attempted murder was not a family dispute. It was a crime. They asked where Melissa was. Dad muttered that she was home, resting as though she were the victim who needed sympathy. I felt a fresh stab of rage, resting while I lay in a hospital gown with tubes in my arms and water still rattling in my lungs. The police promised to follow up, and though my parents seethed, they couldn't stop the law from moving forward now. When the officers left, Mom leaned close, her perfume suffocating. "Do you realize what you've done?" she whispered. "You've ruined this family. Melissa's future. Our reputation, you've destroyed it with your lies." Lies. The word rang like a curse. I stared back at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I whispered back, my voice hoarse but clear. "I'm done protecting her." She flinched just slightly because she realized she no longer held the leash on my silence. Henry stood beside me, his presence like a shield. His eyes daring them to touch me again. I knew then that the fight was just beginning, that the investigation would peel back years of rot that my parents would deny until their last breath, and that Melissa would scheme to paint herself innocent. But this time, I wasn't alone. This time, I had evidence, a witness, and the law on my side. And for the first time, the weight of denial didn't crush me, it fueled me. Because if surviving the river had taught me anything, it was this: I had clawed my way back from death itself. I wasn't about to drown again in silence. The morning of the trial arrived like a storm. Sunlight sliced through the courthouse windows, illuminating the polished wood, the marble floors, and the tense faces of everyone in the room. I was wheeled in my wheelchair now, a symbol of survival rather than weakness. Every click of its wheels echoed like a drumbeat announcing that I was present, that I had a voice, and that I would not be silenced. Melissa sat across the courtroom, her eyes darting between the judge, her lawyer, and me. Her usual confidence was tempered by unease, the kind that creeps in when control begins to slip. My parents flanked her like bodyguards trying to project authority, but their stares were desperate, protective, and fragile. They whispered constantly, their mouths moving, but their words muffled to everyone but themselves. I could feel Henry's hand on mine, his grip steadying the tremors in my arms, reassuring me that I was not alone. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecutor began laying out the case with a precision that left no room for doubt. On the evening of August 14th, the defendant, Melissa Carter, attempted to push her sister Rachel Carter off a cliff while she was in her wheelchair. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and video footage will demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that this act was intentional and life-threatening. I swallowed hard, the words piercing through me like shards of glass, but I didn't look away. The video Henry captured was played on the large screen. Every second of it was clear, the wheelchair teetering Melissa's face pale but resolute, her hands gripping the chair as she shoved. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The officers who responded that night were called to testify, their words precise, unshaken, and factual. The victim was found floating in the river at the base of the cliff, one said. Paramedics noted multiple contusions, bruising, consistent with being forcibly moved, and the victim was hypothermic. I watched Melissa's face crumble imperceptibly with each testimony. Her lawyer tried to argue that it was an accident, that I was careless, that I provoked her sisterly frustration. But the prosecution dismantled each claim, systematically presenting prior incidents, the chair leg smashed into my ribs, the fire locked in childhood, the constant surveillance and threats. It became clear that a pattern existed, a long history of violent control and calculated cruelty. My parents tried to interrupt at first, their faces twisted in anger and disbelief, but the judge silenced them with a single authoritative gesture. This court will hear only evidence relevant to this case. Any outbursts will result in contempt. The power in the judge's voice was intoxicating. For the first time, I felt that law and order truly existed to protect me. When it was my turn to testify, my voice quivered at first, then strengthened. I described every detail, every moment, every fear and betrayal. I spoke of the water cold enough to freeze my lungs, the cliff that loomed like death itself, and the shock of realizing the person who should have loved me tried to end my life. I didn't speak with malice, I spoke with truth. The truth that had been buried under years of lies, under the suffocating weight of my parents' denial. Henry's testimony followed, his eyes locked on Melissa the entire time, unwavering, detailing what he saw: the video, the physical struggle, the attempt to save me. The courtroom was tense, every spectator leaning forward, some holding their breath. The climax came when the DNA results were presented. I had always suspected adoption, but this revelation was staggering. The test proved that Melissa and I were not biologically related, a fact that explained the animosity in a cold, irrational way. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. My parents' faces drained of color. Melissa's jaw dropped, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. Her carefully constructed persona of sisterly love was shattered. The prosecution leaned into the revelation, framing it not as justification, but as a motive. The resentment she carried, knowing I was adopted, fueling the violent acts that led to that night. The defense attempted to spin it differently, but the mounting evidence combined with the emotional gravity of my testimony and Henry's video left them floundering. Witnesses from my past were called: teachers, neighbors, friends, people who had seen signs of Melissa's aggression, who had heard her threats, who had documented the incidents I could not escape. Each word added layers to the narrative of abuse, control, and malice. Melissa's attempts at deflection crumbled under scrutiny. My parents tried to intervene emotionally, but the courtroom remained unwavering. The judge's presence and the law itself protected the truth. When the closing statements arrived, the prosecutor painted a clear picture of danger, betrayal, and cold intent. This was not a moment of passion or carelessness. This was premeditated violence by someone who should have loved but chose to harm. The victim survived by courage, by resilience, and by the presence of a witness who refused to remain silent. Justice must recognize this fact. I listened silent but alive in every nerve, and when the defense concluded, I realized the room had shifted. What once seemed impossible, the acknowledgement of my pain, the recognition of Melissa's attempts to destroy me, was now inevitable. The jury deliberated, the hours crawling, each tick of the clock heavier than the last. Henry squeezed my hand, reminding me that no matter the outcome, I had survived the river. I had survived the fall, and I had survived years of emotional abuse. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson spoke. Melissa was found guilty of attempted murder, the verdict a thunderclap of justice. Her face registered disbelief, fear, and perhaps regret, though I knew some part of her would never truly feel it. My parents sat frozen silent now, realizing their inability to shield her or themselves from accountability. Relief washed over me, a strange and intoxicating mix of vindication, grief, and empowerment. I had survived, and now the law recognized it. The journey to this moment had been brutal, steeped in betrayal, and laden with fear, but the scale of justice had finally tipped in my favor. After the trial, the world felt both heavy and liberating. The weight of years spent under Melissa's shadow of parental neglect and of constant threats had begun to lift, though its traces remained etched into my body and soul. Physical therapy became my new routine, a regimented battle against the paralysis that had once defined me. Each session was grueling, my muscles screaming, my spirit tested. But each small victory, a finger that moved a hand that could grip a shoulder that could bear weight, was a reclamation of power I had never truly possessed before. Henry stayed beside me, his support unwavering, his encouragement a lifeline. He reminded me daily that progress was not linear, that setbacks did not erase victories, and that my value was independent of the cruelty I had endured. I began to establish boundaries with my family, a concept that had been foreign to me for decades. Phone calls were limited visits strictly scheduled and conversations monitored. I no longer allowed Melissa or my parents to dominate my emotional landscape. Their attempts at manipulation, pleas, accusations, and veiled threats were met with calm, firm refusals. I sought counseling to process the psychological scars, understanding that physical recovery alone could not heal years of systemic emotional abuse. Talking to someone trained to navigate trauma helped me unravel the threads of fear, shame, and guilt that had been tightly woven into my identity. I began to journal my experiences, documenting memories once too painful to recall, now transformed into tools of reflection and understanding. Friends I had lost contact with over the years, due to isolation and family control, slowly returned into my life, bringing with them warmth, laughter, and a sense of normalcy I had long forgotten. I reconnected with colleagues, neighbors, and distant relatives, carefully curating a circle that offered support rather than judgment. Financial independence became a priority. I had inherited some assets from my biological parents, and with careful planning, I invested and secured a stable future. This autonomy was not just material, it was symbolic, a tangible declaration that I no longer relied on the family that had harmed me. Social media was a calculated tool rather than a trap. I shared parts of my story, selectively raising awareness about familial abuse while protecting my privacy and mental health. I attended support groups for survivors of domestic violence and sibling aggression, drawing strength from shared experiences and offering my own insights to help others navigate trauma. Every interaction, every decision was framed by a renewed understanding of self-worth. I learned to recognize manipulation, to question motives, and to trust my instincts without guilt. The process was not painless. Memories resurfaced, unbidden nightmares haunted sleep, and occasional pangs of grief reminded me of the person I once was. Yet each confrontation with the past was a reaffirmation of survival. I explored hobbies and passions that had been suppressed, painting, writing, and outdoor activities adapted to my physical capabilities. These creative outlets became expressions of autonomy, joy, and resilience. I also worked on strengthening my body through adaptive fitness, building strength in my upper body, flexibility in my arms, and endurance that allowed greater mobility despite paralysis. As I regained control over my environment, I began establishing concrete legal boundaries. Protective orders were maintained, ensuring that Melissa could not approach or contact me without legal consequences. I worked with lawyers to address financial settlements, medical expenses, and ongoing therapy costs, ensuring that the consequences of her actions were recognized in both legal and practical terms. Holiday gatherings and family events became mine to navigate with discretion. I could choose attendance limit interactions and create safe spaces where emotional safety was prioritized. Gradually, the fear that had once dictated every decision lost its grip. My apartment, my routines, and my relationships became sanctuaries of choice rather than zones of survival. With each passing day, I noticed subtle shifts: a smile that lasted longer, a laugh that felt unburdened, a confidence that grew without apology. Rebuilding life was not an act of revenge. It was an assertion of existence, a declaration that despite trauma control and betrayal, I could thrive. Every boundary set, every therapy session attended, every relationship nurtured, and every personal goal achieved became a testament to resilience and empowerment. My sister's actions had left me paralyzed physically, but the lessons learned in reclaiming my life, asserting autonomy, and fortifying mental and emotional health proved that strength is not measured solely by the body. It is measured by persistence, courage, and the willingness to face the aftermath of violence with clarity and purpose. I had survived the cliff, the wheelchair, and the betrayal. And in doing so, I had built a life where fear no longer dictated my choices and self-worth was unshakable. Months of rebuilding my life led to a moment I had both dreaded and anticipated for years, the public revelation of the truth about my adoption and my sister's violent actions. It began as a quiet decision, a choice to share my story with the world, not out of vengeance, but to prevent others from suffering in silence. I arranged a controlled press conference, carefully inviting media outlets and advocates for survivors of domestic abuse and familial violence. The room was filled with cameras, microphones, and reporters, all eager to understand the story that had gripped my small town and family circles for years. As I stepped up to the podium, my wheelchair positioned prominently so that my physical reality was undeniable, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was a culmination of years of therapy preparation and careful legal guidance. I began by recounting my childhood experiences, small instances of favoritism toward Melissa, the gaslighting by my parents, and the escalating physical abuse that had finally led to my paralysis on the cliff. I spoke calmly, my voice steady yet imbued with the emotional gravity of each event, ensuring that the audience could understand both the factual timeline and the emotional toll. The narrative included the discovery of my adoption, the shocking DNA results, and how the revelation of my biological lineage had only intensified Melissa's rage and control attempts. Reporters took notes, frantically, some whispering to each other about the implications, while others recorded every word for broadcast. The courtroom documents, medical records, and DNA evidence were presented visually, making it impossible to dismiss or discredit my account. I described the day Melissa pushed me toward the cliff, the paralyzing injuries, and the immediate chaos that ensued, the neighbors who witnessed it, the paramedics, and the ultimate confrontation with the police. Every detail was accounted for, and my sister's denial, once effective at isolating me emotionally, now seemed hollow and absurd under the weight of evidence. The climax of the presentation came when I revealed the DNA results. The room collectively held its breath as I stated that I was biologically related to a branch of the family that no one had suspected, confirming my place in the broader lineage and dismantling my sister's narrative that my existence was an intrusion or a shameful secret. The shock on reporters' faces mirrored the family's reaction, which I knew had been watching the broadcast live from separate locations. My parents, who had attempted to minimize the abuse and control Melissa wielded over me, were visibly unsettled. Their expressions were a mixture of guilt, fear, and disbelief. This was the first time they had confronted the undeniable truth, and the impact was palpable, even through the television screen. Following the press conference, I scheduled a private family meeting in a neutral location with my lawyers present, making it clear that I would not tolerate manipulation, gaslighting, or physical threats. Melissa arrived attempting to feign concern and confusion, but the air was thick with tension and accountability. I presented the evidence once again, this time directly to her, with witnesses and legal professionals ensuring the confrontation remained controlled. Each moment of denial, each attempt to twist the facts was met with calm but firm correction. I made it explicitly clear that her actions had consequences not only legally but emotionally and socially. The meeting escalated when I laid out the legal repercussions of her assault, the ongoing medical and therapy expenses she was liable for, and the public record that now cemented her actions in the eyes of the law. My parents attempted to intervene, but I asserted my autonomy decisively. I reminded them that their inaction and past encouragement of Melissa's behavior contributed to my suffering, and that reconciliation would require acknowledgement, accountability, and respect for my boundaries. As the confrontation reached its peak, I allowed myself a moment of catharsis, the release of years of pent-up anger and fear. Melissa began to break down crying openly for the first time in a context that did not center her, but rather reflected the consequences of her actions. It was a surreal moment, her emotional collapse, a direct result of the undeniable truth she had tried to obscure for decades. The public revelation and family confrontation marked a turning point. I had reclaimed my narrative, established undeniable authority over my story, and ensured that the consequences for violence and manipulation were visible, concrete, and unavoidable. The sense of justice was not derived from vengeance alone, but from the recognition that the truth could not be silenced, and that survival, resilience, and courage had created an unassailable position from which I could continue to live freely. Moving forward, I felt empowered to make decisions without fear of retaliation, manipulation, or guilt. The family dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The balance of power was no longer held by those who had inflicted harm, but by the individual who had endured, survived, and reclaimed control. My voice, once marginalized and silenced, now carried authority, and my life, once defined by fear and paralysis, now embodied strength, autonomy, and unwavering resolve. Every step I had taken since the incident on the cliff led to this moment, and the acknowledgement of the truth by family, media, and community reinforced the transformative power of transparency and courage. After the public revelation and the intense family confrontation, the aftermath unfolded with a mixture of legal action, social consequences, and personal reflection. Melissa, now exposed fully to the legal system, and the public faced the reality of her actions. My lawyers had meticulously documented every instance of abuse, physical assault, and psychological manipulation, including the incident on the cliff, the relentless torment leading to my paralysis, and the years of gaslighting by my parents. The evidence was irrefutable, and the courts moved swiftly to hold her accountable. She faced charges of assault, attempted manslaughter, and reckless endangerment, each supported by medical reports, eyewitness accounts, and previously ignored complaints I had filed. The public exposure of her behavior meant that her social circle, friends, and professional contacts began to distance themselves. Calls went unanswered, invitations ceased, and the reputation she had carefully cultivated over years of manipulation began to crumble. Meanwhile, my parents, initially defensive and resistant to acknowledging their complicity, faced pressure to address their enabling behavior. They were required to attend counseling sessions and provide restitution for medical costs and therapy actions they had long avoided. I continued my own physical and psychological rehabilitation, embracing the autonomy and freedom I had fought for. Every day involved strengthening my body within the limitations of my paralysis, but also reinforcing mental resilience through therapy and support groups. The contrast between my growth and Melissa's decline was stark. Each legal hearing, each public acknowledgement of the truth emphasized her accountability and my empowerment. The community, once indifferent or misled by family narratives, began to see me as a survivor and advocate offering support and recognition for my courage. The financial restitution mandated by the court allowed me to address medical debts, therapy expenses, and modifications to my home to accommodate my wheelchair. Beyond material support, the legal and social recognition of my ordeal validated my experiences in a way that my family had never allowed. Melissa's legal battles were compounded by the exposure of her behavior to wider audiences. Media coverage highlighted not only the assault on the cliff, but also the pattern of abuse and control. She faced civil suits as well from neighbors and other witnesses whose lives had been disrupted by her reckless actions. The combination of criminal, civil, and social consequences created a comprehensive system of accountability that could not be ignored or manipulated. Personally, I focused on rebuilding a life defined by choice rather than fear. I pursued educational goals I had set aside, engaged in advocacy for survivors of domestic and familial abuse, and established a support network that emphasized honesty, integrity, and mutual respect. Relationships formed on trust and care replaced those conditioned by manipulation and control. Despite the intensity of the past trauma, I found moments of genuine joy, fulfillment, and connection. Melissa's attempts to intimidate or retaliate were mitigated by the legal structures and my own resilience. and each small victory reinforced the message that abusive power could be dismantled through persistence, evidence, and courage. I maintained strict boundaries, enforcing distance from toxic individuals and prioritizing my safety and mental health. Public recognition and media coverage highlighted not only the brutality of the attack, but also the strategic, intelligent responses that ensured justice was served. The story of my paralysis, my adoption, and the shocking DNA revelation served as a cautionary tale and inspiration, demonstrating the possibility of reclaiming life and agency after profound trauma. Through careful planning, unwavering persistence, and utilization of legal and social mechanisms, I transformed a moment of near death and betrayal into a platform for justice awareness and empowerment. The consequences for Melissa were undeniable, systemic, and visible to all, reinforcing the principle that manipulation, violence, and familial abuse could not escape accountability. This period solidified my belief in self-advocacy, courage in the face of fear, and the transformative power of speaking truth to those who would deny or distort it. The aftermath, while challenging, became a framework for a new life rooted in independence, recognition of self-worth, and ongoing vigilance against toxicity. Every action taken during this period was deliberate, aimed at ensuring lasting justice and personal empowerment. The balance of power had shifted permanently, and the consequences for abusive behavior were now clear and unavoidable. With justice served and the legal consequences for Melissa firmly in place, I finally began to reclaim a life that had been stolen from me for so long. Every day became an exercise in asserting independence, celebrating small victories, and embracing the freedom that comes from breaking the cycle of abuse. My home, adapted to my wheelchair, transformed into a safe haven where I could live without fear, make decisions for myself, and nurture a sense of normalcy and peace that had been denied during years of torment. I returned to my educational ambitions with renewed determination, enrolling in courses that had once seemed out of reach, immersing myself in studies, and connecting with mentors who respected my experiences and capabilities. Socially, I surrounded myself with people who valued honesty, empathy, and respect, carefully building relationships that reinforced my sense of agency and self-worth. The media coverage of my story continued to reach audiences not as a source of pity, but as a testament to resilience, strategic resistance, and intelligent response to cruelty. I began speaking to groups of survivors, sharing insights on recognizing abuse, protecting oneself, and utilizing legal and social systems to reclaim control. Each engagement reinforced the reality that trauma could be transformed into empowerment when met with courage, planning, and unwavering resolve. Financially, restitution and careful management allowed me to live independently, fund ongoing therapy, and support adaptive needs, eliminating the constraints imposed by past dependence and parental neglect. Melissa's downfall remained a cautionary tale visible to the community, a reminder that unchecked violence and manipulation would ultimately lead to consequences that could not be evaded. Internally, I focused on healing mindfulness and establishing routines that reinforced stability and personal growth. Physical therapy, mental health support, and gradual reintegration into social activities created a balanced structure that nurtured resilience and adaptability. I set long-term goals, envisioning a future where my experiences informed advocacy, education, and the creation of a network for others affected by familial abuse. Reflection on the past provided both lessons and gratitude for survival, strategic action, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Each day reinforced my ability to make choices for myself, to reject fear and manipulation, and to live authentically despite past trauma. The cliff, the paralysis, the betrayal, and the shocking revelations of my adoption were no longer sources of shame or control, but milestones in a journey of empowerment and personal reclamation. Looking forward, I embraced opportunities for joy, creativity, and connection, understanding that while the past shaped me, it no longer defined the boundaries of my life. The story concluded not with fear or victimhood, but with triumph, resilience, and a clear demonstration that calculated resistance, courage, and intelligence could turn trauma into a foundation for strength, independence, and ongoing fulfillment.